So this week we'll discuss chapter 5 in Heichaltzu. Last week, as we discussed chapter 4, we spoke about division and unity and what things about each one. How division is precious, and for unity we need bittul, the ability to transcend oneself, go out of himself. An obvious question is, okay, so I need bittul. Where do I pick up bittul? Where do I go to? And more than that, it's not only where do I get it, is it possible to get it? But bittul, you're basically telling me to stop existing, seemingly, to leave myself. If I leave myself, if I'm not here, then what unity is taking place? I'm dissolving. So you have two people that reach bittul, they both don't exist. Where do you get this bittul? Is it attainable for us? And how does this play out in actual relationships? So, chapter, he identifies bittul with chachma. Chachma being one of the 10 spheres and one of the 10 faculties that we have, every one of us. And it's by chachma that we find bittul. So let's figure that out. Where is chachma? How do I attain chachma? How does chachma connect with bittul? How does that play out?
Okay, so Chachma, the first time we meet it, at least in Chassidus, is in Tanya Perek Gimel. And the Alter Rebbe over there introduces the idea that Chachma, you could split into two words, and over here in the Maimer, he repeats it, Koyach Ma. It's a very powerful energy. Ma, what is it? In other words, there's something intangible of it. And in the words of modern linguists, you could translate the word Chachma as the power of creativity. I remember giving a shir years ago, and they asked me to give a shape. The interesting thing, give me a shape for Chachma, Bin, and Das. And I can't say it's 100% accurate, but for me, the idea of Chachma was like this dot. Bina was a horizontal line, in other words, this way. And Das is a vertical line, in other words, it penetrates, it goes into you. So Chachma is the beginning of an idea. And I'll be honest, and I think that's what we're going to discuss together. Chachma is a very hard thing to define. I mean, the whole concept of Chachma is undefinable. That's what it is. It's a kind of intelligence that's not definable. And when you start discussing Chachma and you start analyzing, it's almost like...
So we're trying to have a discussion about something that can't be discussed, because if it's discussed, it's already Bina and down.
Correct.
Sort of. There's no oisius in Chachma.
Yeah. So the truth is, when anyone tries to get to Chachma and talk about bittul, those are two things that the moment you start talking about them, it's like, who are you? There's something very... A person trying to describe bittul, unless you've actually achieved it, then what are you talking about? You're talking about an haskala, you're talking about a theory, and so too with Chachma. So we know that Chassidus is there for real people. So having met, talked to a lot of people and trying to understand creativity, I think it's important that we bring about creativity. Now, often when we talk about creativity, it's very narrow. We think of artists and musicians, and that's a definition of creative. So the average person who's not a musician, or even if they're a musician, they're not exceptional, they're good at reading notes, or art, they're good at filling in numbers, they ask themselves, what's creativity? And Chachma becomes a thing that's...
Right, we use the 10 spheres, 10 koiches. Many people will tell you that from and down, exception of a few others, but they can find it in themselves. It's easy to find it. They relate to it on a day-to-day level. Chachma, many people, they're not creative. They don't have these sparks and these flashes of lightning, and they don't have any patented discoveries. But we say Chachma is part of our makeup. We all have Chachma, and this is what you're asking. So where do I find Chachma?
So I think there's many ways of dissecting. I don't think there's one absolute answer to that, but I'll tell you the way it talks to me. Let's talk about Chachma, the way it connects to bittul. As I said, it's hard to define bittul if I'm not a batal dikayid. But what is bittul? Bittul is the lack of self. I don't take up space. the famous story of the Baal Shem Tov that he came to a town and he didn't know there was two places to stay. One was a very frum yid, but a lot of gaiva, and the other person was not so fafrumt, but a very humble person. The Baal Shem Tov said, I'll stay by the second one, because regarding the first one, the Eibishter says, Hashem and this person cannot stay together in the same space. What does it mean? It's not that Hashem punishes the guy. Hashem, there's no space for him. There's no space for him. So, bittul is that the fact that you don't take up space. So let me give you an example. You walk into a shir, and ultimately you're here to listen, or you're watching this Fabdengen as we speak. I'll tell you the difference, the way coming and listening to this shir in a Chachma approach or a Bina approach. The Bina approach is, let's start with that, you walk in and you're already analyzing this shir as we're speaking. So imagine, you're watching this talk, two brothers talking, you're analyzing, okay, is it interesting, is it not interesting, is it clever, is it not clever, is it sumzach, is it not sumzach? And what you're doing is you're stepping outside the scenario. You're not allowing yourself to get lost in the scenario, getting lost in the information. As my mashpir used to tell me in Fabrengens, he used to say, stop being a journalist. Stop standing on the outside, go in. Chachma is when you walk into a scenario, whether it's you're giving the shir or you're listening to the shir, but for that time, you don't exist. You're not taking up space. You're allowing a new idea either to come from somebody else or to come from within. But you're creating a vacuum in which intelligence, in which new ideas, in which creativity could come. For me, the biggest mashal, we might have spoke about last week, is the idea of actors and actresses. What's a good actor? When you watch a good actor acting, what's the genius of it? And what's a bad actor? A good actor is when you can't even tell they're acting, it almost feels like that person is that role. They totally lost themselves in their role. A bad actor is someone who's self-conscious while they're acting. They can't lose themselves in the role. In other words, in order to do creativity, there can't be me. Chachma, true wisdom, at least at the beginning of the process, is the ability to not be there, to not get in the way of the intelligence, to allow a new idea, a new brainstorm, a new shir that you're going into to take space and then to dissect it. That's the way I see Chachma in the day-to-day life of each and every one of us.
Right, so when you associate it with creativity, so many people initially will argue that creative people are more independent people. Independence, isn't that more yeshus? Where do you see bittul? Someone without chachma, someone that's not creative, is just following what everyone tells them. So you just have a sense of bittul. Creativity seems to be independence, self, a strong self-esteem. Is creativity associated with bittul? And why? Isn't creativity ready to go against the status quo, do your own thing?
So interesting. You touched on a topic that each person has their Zari trait. Chances are when Levi Avtzon opens his mouth by Fabdengen, he ends up talking about this. This is like my ultimate pet peeve. Why? Because I think even as film kids growing up, one of the big struggles we have is how we define creativity. Usually creativity means if I define myself as a creative, my yarmulke becomes pink, my beard starts looking a little different.
From and creative, chassidus and creative.
In other words, like the moment, for me, I've always struggled with that concept that if you define yourself as creative, you have to start looking different. But the funny thing is all the people that are looking different are actually all looking the same. They all look like creatives. And I actually said at some stage in my life, I know it's off tangent, but the black and white dress that Chassidim accepted to dress that way, I'm not going to blame it on any specific Rebbe or Shishir. It forced me, obviously I could have decided to dress otherwise, it forced me to define my creativity in deeper ways than the color of yarmulke I'm wearing today, and to actually find it in a more meaningful way. I often think that people claim their creativity in ways that are totally uncreative. In other words, true creativity is not the ability to walk around and be unique the way everyone else is unique. True creativity is to go into your own mind and to generate.
You're saying we really made it in life if we reach a stage that there's a certain conformism to creativity.
Of course there is. Well, you look in New York, the yuppies. All the yuppies are considering themselves modern, but they're all looking the same. You see a yuppie from a mile. So you're bucking the trend, but technically you just developed your own trend. And that's what happens. Like you chilled out, you joined whatever, the chilled community, and now you all look the same. So why is that creative? Creativity has to be deeper. Creativity is the way you think. Creativity is how you process information. For example, each person's going to learn the same Heichaltzu, and each person's going to walk out Farbrengen differently. I mean, even us, we spent quite a while before the Shir, before this Farbrengen, analyzing what the Eis is saying. It's the same Eis, we're reading it, it's the same Hebrew, and even the translation is the same. But ultimately, how it's being digested and how it's being turned into my idea, not in an egoistic way, but my Torah, that is the process of creativity, where it becomes my own. But the only way I could do it is when I'm learning the mimer, I'm not already mixing my ashkafis while I'm learning, because then I'm not getting the content. When I'm learning Hey, I sit down and I hear what the Rebbe Hashab is here to tell me. I create a vacuum where my ego goes out. Then after that vacuum, now there's space for bina, dissection, developing it, and obviously das, to make it personal in my own life. Chachma is not a rocket science. I think it's a basic thing that we all have, and that's the ability to get out of your own head. And like, how often does that happen? You know those incredible Farbrengens. I can't claim I've been by many, but I've been by few. It usually happens a few hours into the Farbrengen where people lose self-consciousness. And there's a space, there's an intimacy that comes with a bunch of people who are just comfortable to be there and are not self-conscious. At that moment, that's when Farbrengens really start. Well, I remember hearing many times, the Farbrengen only starts at 1 a.m. There's a truth to that. Because as long as my ego, my insecurities are getting in the way of the content won't come in, it won't permeate me, it won't affect me.
Right, so if I'm someone that's just processing available content or things that I already know before, and I'm just finding new ways of articulation, then we can do without bittul. But to receive something new, which is what chachma is, that's where bittul is needed. That's where bittul takes place. And that's why bittul is what brings sort of the creativity, the new ideas. So let's get into practically, because ultimately, while we need chachma and bina and all these things, and as we'll discuss later on in the mimer, especially in the later chapters, but relationships in general happen on a emotional level. It's in the middos where the relationships happen. It's where the good relationships happen and where the dysfunctional relationships happen. That's where the fights happen and the hate happens. So right now we're functioning on a middos relationship. And someone comes and says, I have sinna, if it's the gvura of toyu or etzim of toyu, in other words, if there's a reason for the hate or just this essential hate that just exists because we're two different people and you take up my space. How does chachma enter? How do I go about this? Where does chachma enter a relationship? I should start intellectualizing and conceptualizing the relationship. I should stop having an emotional relationship. How does it even work? Start just having ideological discussions, and that's going to save the relationship.
So again, I'll give you an example. We both of us do speaking. At least a big part of making a living is we do speaking. You get up on the
at least one. Oh, yeah. At least one of us
making a living, but it occupies your day. And you get up and you're talking in front of a pulpit or in front of Zoom, whatever. If you're self-conscious while you're talking, your talk is going to be 50% the quality than if you're not self-conscious. Why? Because what it
on a good day.
Huh?
On a good day.
Yeah, I'm saying it destroys it. That's why, like, when people get there and they feel very shy, it literally destroys the ability to give information. Now, if I come over there and I'm gung-ho and I'm sharing, it's not because I'm full of ego. It's because I'm allowing the content to go through me. Yes, I could do it with ego. It could be the whole show, the whole speech is about how I'm perceived. But again, then I'm going to sacrifice the quality of the speech. When you get up, you're giving a shir, or you're trying to do, outreach and to be mekadev yidden. If your self-consciousness gets in the way, it's going to destroy. Same thing in relationships. If I'm coming into a relationship, I'm talking to my spouse, I'm talking to my kid, and I'm feeling myself, while I'm talking, then chances are I'm not feeling them. I remember someone gave me an interesting definition for musar. Not the musar ashkafa, but like sometimes you have to give it over to your friend or your sibling or your kid over the head. And they said like this: if you're enjoying it even an ounce, then don't give it. If you're having any hana'ah, giving the tzveit nibben cup, then don't. Why? Because at that moment, you're not doing a bittul. You got in the way. Sometimes we need to give it to each other over the head. That's life. We all need, to be given boundaries and to be reminded of the boundaries. But when the person doing it is not doing it for my sake, but for their own sake, in other words, they're getting nachas and enjoyment from what they're doing, then it's not going to be pile. That's today's ayom yom. It's not going to be pile when you get in the way. In any relationship, any midah, there has to be something bigger than what I want.
Right, but that's where it gets tricky because relationships, midos, just from what they are, there's a very strong sense of me. So it says that Ava, Chayzer el Oyev, Yesh Misha Oyev. Emotions by definition are yesh. That's what they are. My feelings. So if you're talking to me about, when you're listening to shir, which is an intellectual pursuit, okay, so shut down your emotions, take away your excitement. And I had a friend who's come to every shir, and just jumping up and down is all excited. Fine, we get that. Calm that down and get involved. But how do you bring chachma into a relationship? When a relationship, by definition, is midos, it's an emotional relationship with a sibling, with a spouse, with a child, with a parent, and that's what happens. In other words, relationships, midos are just the way they are. They're full of turmoil, and they sort of eat you up. And then we say no, enter chachma.
So it's interesting. Kuntra Sumayan, one of the most famous, my mother and everybody learns also by the Rebbe Rashab. Right at the beginning, in the second, not chapter, because the first ois, I believe, has a few halakim, but the second chalik of the first ois, he talks about the 4 levels of pleasure. He starts off in the lowest level of pleasure is physical and bodily pleasure, food, etc., sleep. The second pleasure, if I could paraphrase, is art, negina, art. It's a more luchnistic pleasure. It's not so tangible. And the third one, I remember when I was learning it, it caught me. He says, chesed al pi seichel. And the fourth one, he says, is obviously dvarim sichlim, intelligence. But the third one, chesed al pi seichel, and he explains that Avram Avinu, he did chesed, but it was always mitzeichel. It wasn't there to destroy. In other words, not giving a knife to a kid. In other words, even midas, they can't be divorced from at least the ability of being able, like I said it earlier as a negative, but to be able to be a journalist. In other words, to be able to step out of the midah, to be able to step out of your ka'as or out of your chemda, your jealousy, or whatever it is at that moment, and to be able to control yourself. That's what Tanya teaches us. It's the ability of taking the power that moichin has, which is objectivity, and what we said, chachma, the idea of bittul, getting out of it. And yes, there's certain times that we have to get into the relationship, but when it's turning into dysfunctional, when my ego is not building the relationship, because yesh mishayev, there's space for my ego, a healthy ego in a relationship, otherwise it's been ashmata. But when my ego is getting in the way of the relationship, then I have to bring my moichin and sit there saying, okay, control yourself. Contain.
But there's something interesting in the Sif. He mentions that not only the chachma has bittul, it's poil the bittul gam b'hamidas. In other words, there's a stage of you got to leave the midas. Perhaps there are times that you have to put the midas on stop, on pause, enter chachma. But then the ultimate goal is that the bittul of chachma permeates into the midas, right? The goal isn't that we should just have 2 people that are completely bottle and have no emotional interaction. So the bigger kunz is sort of that when I enter that place of chachma, I'm able then to take that bittul of chachma, which obviously would be sort of a struggle because you're taking an element of bittul of moichin and bringing it into midos, which is a world of self.
So I'm going to go back to the example I said earlier about speaking. I remember I was talking one time to a big Rav overseas, a master orator. He really speaks well. And he told me every time before he speaks, he gets up and mumbles to himself. He walks over to the Kodesh, he's in the shul, and he says, Hashem tzvasei tiftach v'yagid yilasecha. Says to himself, whatever. And ever since he told it to me, I adopted. I don't necessarily say those words, but I try to remember every time before I talk to ask why. Obviously, my personality is going to come out when I speak. I'm speaking based on my personality. So if my midah of chesed or netzach is strong, my personality is oozing. But if I at least don't start with a mindfulness that, yes, Hashem wants my character to come out of my midas, but there's no baseline of basic, don't get in the way of it, then my midas are not only going to not help the information I'm trying to share, they're going to get in the way of it.
So midas sort of need the mashkiach of chachma. Chachma is this moderator that allows my midas to function properly and not self-sabotage.
And that's the gift of tikkun. Tikkun is midas contained by moichin. That's the definition of tikkun. That there's boundaries. There's somebody there's a voice within us. Tanya explains, there's a voice within us that's able to contain. And sometimes you allow your midas to go free, like, your child's getting married, or sometimes. But there's a lot of times that our midas have to be contained. So that children are midas without moichin. Chassidus often talks about it. That's why they jump from one mood to the other. What's the ability of maturing? What's the definition of maturing and becoming an adult? That the moichin starts containing the midas, that your midas are run according to moichin. That's the fundamental difference, at least according to Chassidus, between children and adults.
Right. All right, where are we holding? We have some time, or?
As you wish.
Right, so we're coming actually to Rosh Chodesh Sivan. From Matan Torah, we know that Rosh Chodesh Sivan is the day of Heichaltzu Yisrael Neged Ahar Ki Ish Echad Levi, total oneness, is the famous Sikha of the Rebbe in Chelik Chav Ches, volume 28, on Rosh Chodesh Sivan. That what happened on the day of Rosh Chodesh, the Gemara says that day Moshe Rabbeinu didn't tell the Jews anything. From Beis Sivan, Gimel Sivan, the days leading up to Matan Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu prepared them for Matan Torah, for the giving of the Torah. On Rosh Chodesh, there was nothing. Why didn't he tell them anything? There's a whole long discussion there. The Rebbe asked many questions. And the point is that there's this preparation that precedes all other preparations for Matan Torah, which is this silence, saying nothing. Sort of this gili of Chachma, perhaps. This Chachma, and that's what creates this unity of Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar. So, yes, sort of to come together, there will have to be this element of shtika. We say that Chachma is higher than Oisius. There aren't Oisius. There isn't anything to be said. There are times that people just have to come to the same room. We just want to get people to come to the same room and have discussions, and people have arguments. So one thing actually that I've mentioned other times is that when people meet, initially don't speak about things that you argue about. Speak about things that are neutral. But here there's perhaps even something before all that. Before you even speak about things that are neutral, don't speak. Silence. Complete silence. It could be a niggun, or even without a niggun, just complete silence. There isn't anything to be said. Just allow yourself to be absorbed in the atmosphere and the environment. And I guess similarly in many relationships, just be taken over by something greater. Obviously, the ultimate chachma, we mentioned this chachma in general, we all have chachma, but then there's chachma that waits in kedusha, chachma of atzilus, and chachma of nefesh alikis, being batul ta'ir mitzvah. Accept a greater reality than ourselves, and allowing that to permeate our day-to-day lives and our relationships.
Yeah, I'll finish off with
closing thoughts.
I remember hearing as a bacher, let the Rebbe talk through you. And I remember hearing it. It was a very esoteric concept. It sounded very fancy-pantsy. Like, I'll be honest, it sounded chassidish, but it had no relevance. Then you go on shlichus, and
or it sounds like when you chazer the sikh, you just get up and say, the Rebbe asks, and the Rebbe answers, and the Rebbe asks,
100%.
The Rebbe answers,
yeah,
the Rebbe asks again.
And then the Rebbe goes in the derech agav, and I'm going to share you all of the details. And at some stage, you actually realize it, especially when you're doing every day, you're reaching out with Yidden, etc. You should realize if you get out of the way, you'll have a lot more atzlacha. Let the Rebbe talk through you. In other words, you went to Temchet Rimim, you went to whatever. You went and you got the chinuch. So you know the content. The Rebbe's educated you for 25, 30 years. Now get out and allow that information, obviously based on your own midas, to get over to the other person. But don't get in the way. It's very real. It's actually not an abstract concept. It's like, don't get in the way. The idea is great. The information is great. Use your personality to give it over, but don't get in the way.
Okay, we will stay out of the way. We'll take a small.
It's